Good morning and welcome to the latest masterclass as part of the Global Family Visit Summit organised by Family Business United. I'm delighted to be enjoying the week so far. We've had some fantastic sessions. This morning we're looking at a different topic and something that's not often discussed. Business owners often underestimate the impact their loss or incapacity may have on a business. And I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Hayden Bailey from Boodle Hatfield to talk about the matter. Good morning, Hayden.
Good morning, Paul. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Good, thank you. Nice to see you. Do you want to start off just by giving us a little introduction to who you are and your role within the world of family business?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much for having us today. So I'm Hayden Bailey. I'm head of private client at Boodle Hatfield. Boodle Hatfield is a law firm. It's a 300-year-old law firm and has always advised business owners on their asset protection and succession planning strategy. We're a full service firm, but our focus is on a relatively small set of clients that we look after as they go through transitions. So particularly these sorts of family business transitions are a key area of our practice.
Okay, fantastic. And as I said just now, it's planning for the worst is one of those things. An emergency board plans, it's not often discussed in the public forum because it's one of those things that families like to try and keep a bit more private. So do you want to take us through some of the challenges and set the scene for what we're going to explore today?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So an emergency board plan is, you're absolutely right, something that isn't necessarily top of the agenda. People don't like to talk about death. They don't like to talk about incapacity, and particularly in a business context. Everything will be focused upon generating money, upon day-to-day business, keeping the show on the road in that way. An emergency plan is a duty of directors. You have to, as a director's fundamental duty, be aware of what crisis management looks like. And so having a protocol for a crisis is hugely important. So an emergency board plan is most simple, and I'll call it an EBP because that's easier, is a protocol for a business to deal with a situation of what should happen in the short term following the sustained absence, incapacity or death or otherwise of the business founder, a CEO, otherwise head of the family business. And what it should do is address what processes, what is needed in the first hour, the first week, the first month, the first quarter, first year, etc., in the event of a crisis happening. It's a crisis management plan. It needs to be kept under regular review to ensure it's appropriate and can enable the board to continue in functioning. So why is something like this important? Well, for me, as an advisor on succession planning for family businesses, as I'm sure you've heard lots of other people talk about as part of this conference, is a very amorphous, arbitrary subject. It talks about, well, what do you want? What do you define success for your business like over a very long period? This sort of vocabulary used when discussing succession planning concepts for businesses can be very different to an entrepreneurial business mindset where you're dealing with a product, you're dealing with an acquisition, it has a beginning and it has an end. When someone says, what are things going to look like for future generations? It's just often too difficult to approach. And therefore there is an element of avoiding the ongoing, seemingly unended cost. And there's a professional cost there of engaging with that issue. So it lacks tangible deliverables in a sense of sort of associated cost and consideration without an obvious end. Therefore, starting at the end and saying, okay, well, let's not think about what we really want in terms of lifetime succession, and let's look at what would happen if you died today. The immediacy of that question, in my experience, gets business owners immediately thinking about, well, what actually would need to happen if I suddenly wasn't here. As soon as you've captured that and you've started thinking about, well, who would deal with talking to the staff, who would actually, what about that deal that we're in the process of doing, etc. As soon as you start engaging with those processes, then it is the seed of a legacy plan that starts to open up and break down some of those more difficult and wider questions. It's a little bit like when I advise clients generally on wills. when clients come to see me and talk about succession planning, whether that's for their business or other interests, then I generally start at the end and I say, well, let's do your will. Let's think about what would happen if you weren't here at all. And actually, because you're writing yourself out of the script, you're no longer the protagonist and you're no longer concerned about control or power sharing because you're simply not there. It's actually much easier to visualize. So I find that EBPs, emergency board plans, in dealing with business owners are actually a much more accessible way to start the conversation. The other good thing that's linked to that is that, unlike maybe a more detailed legacy plan that talks about these more arbitrary concepts around power sharing and share ownership and dividend policy and these sorts of things, is that an emergency board plan can be shown to everyone. There's nothing to be afraid of in that. It's not a private document in that way. It is a very mechanical document in a way, with its process and protocol in place. And it will say, these are the decisions that the board will take. These are the decisions that will be reserved. These are the reserved matters for the shareholders. Although obviously care is required there as to who the shareholder group will be, whether you have trustees, etc. But the trustees of any family business trusts should see a copy of the EBP. It will give them reassurance. The staff, or senior staff, should see a copy of the EBP. It will give them reassurance as well, because they can see, in the event of a crisis, there is a clear process there. It should be shown to the children, it should be shown to the family, because it will manage their expectations as to what would happen in that crisis situation. It is part of a wider discussion around the board generally, and identifying successors and power sharing on the board. But that is nuanced, and that is a separate part to crisis management. And many family businesses fail to implement any sort of decision process in a crisis management plan, and it creates a real power vacuum. You have a single point of failure in key people in family businesses, and it's much more acute in family businesses than any other business structure. Indeed, when you think about a family business, the concept of a functioning board is often slightly nascent or non-existent. The board, in many ways, will not exist other than maybe a kitchen table board. And by that, I mean that there will be discussions ad hoc, very agile, very quick, no cost sort of and delay and bureaucracy, real thriving nature of a family business to make those decisions quickly at the kitchen table board. But that does lead to I am the board mentality within entrepreneurial family businesses. And obviously the position is very different where you have a sibling partnership or a cousin consortium. And over time, the way that decision-making process within the family owners is shared is something that will create a sense of board. But there's a lot of family businesses that I work with where if I say to them, do you have a COO? Do you have a CFO, an FD, or sort of who is the MD? Who's your head of HR? Who's your head of business development? It's often that person. Well, I am the brand. I do the business development. I am all of that. But there may well be a set of trusted advisors and key staff and employees who effectively hold these roles. Yeah, we have someone who deals with HR and someone who deals with comms and these sorts of things, but not necessarily enshrined in a board. Now, creating a board is actually a separate discussion, Paul, and to be honest, that's not what we're talking about today. But thinking about an emergency board plan is a brilliant way into that discussion about the evolution and growth of a family business board from a nascent kitchen table, I am the board mentality, towards a more trusted and ultimately strategic and fiduciary board that would involve other professionals, family trustees, and a CFO, COO, and other C-suite positions. It's really difficult to approach a decision with families to say, you should have a board, because that's a natural challenge to power. And naturally, we avoid those sorts of challenges because they can be disruptive. Business as usual, and to an extent, forgive me, sort of, this is the way things are done here, is a natural sort of safe particularly when it's your business, it's your train set in a way, then you have that. So it is easier to govern in a way without governance, without government. But an emergency board plan gets the mentality into thinking, yeah, okay, well, who is the right person to be in a decision-making situation? And so as a board evolves, it has an additional role in helping build and maintain the trust between the family owners and the family managers. As soon as independents are in the board, then you need to start looking at, and it evolves naturally into decisions around family councils and owner forums, etc., of the communication between the underlying owners and the way that the board operates. So that's sort of, I think, why you start with an EBP. I still haven't really said what it looks like in a way. I think it is worth saying at this point that directors, and say, for example, you have a husband and wife, or a sibling sort of direct, where the only directors are husband and wife, or possibly sort of two sisters or brothers or whatever, then there is a duty on the directors to consider emergency planning. That is a fundamental duty. It is a legal duty. They must acknowledge their duty to how the business would manage an unexpected situation, a crisis, an unexpected transition. Directors have to act with appropriate diligence, in good faith, in the best interests of the company. It's hard to see a more important area for directors to focus on than how the company will be managed in the event of emergency. And creating an emergency board plan is a way to fulfill that legal obligation while taking steps, as I say, towards a wider succession strategy. Note there that when I'm mentioning directors' duties, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but bear with me in a way, is that directors must act in the best interests of the company. That's very different to acting in the best interests of the shareholders. And therefore, when we are thinking about the board and an emergency board plan, we've got to remember that this is about what's in the best interests of the company, not necessarily what is in the best interests of the family. That's difficult, but addressing the plan by the founder generation, or reviewed and reinvigorated by future generations, enables the directors to understand what their role is in relation to the company, and at the same time have that liaison and that communication and reporting built into it, which could be part of the plan, part of the EBP, on how that is reporting to a shareholder council or otherwise. So monitoring the planning for that board transition is a really important part. So I mean, you can make the situation easier and put less focus on an emergency by setting a retirement age. I mean, all businesses will have a general expectation that the CEO or business leader service will end at some point. For family businesses, is that death? Is that sort of, if it were an external CEO, probably expect them to retire at 60, 65. That is a difficult and slightly taboo subject within a family business. And you think about the sort of families that are in the news at the moment, where you've got Murdoch sort of talking about succession, you've got the program Succession in a way, and you've got Buffett and different views, and a range of particularly European family businesses where people are living an extremely long time. I do another session on the 100-year life, which is a fascinating topic in itself. But business owners are active and engaged for 100 years of their life, quite potentially for our generation and beyond. So thinking about that board transition, and rather than necessarily an emergency, morphing the discussion into a retirement age, and thinking as to how a successor would be approached, and how a successor is identified, is a really important part of this discussion. And it helps manage expectations, not only for the staff, but also for the next generation. So the board should be regularly assessing not only the current CEO position, but also the capabilities of other executives to take on that role. That's an ongoing process. I mean, I know everyone will know this and everyone will do it to an extent, but how actively is it actually documented? And there is a 360 review process and an element of talent academy and spotting within the business. Everyone will sort of, oh, well, yeah, these people will probably step up to the role in a way, but an expectation that people will suddenly step up to the role in a crisis situation puts a huge pressure, and unless that's enunciated clearly and documented, people can fall apart in a crisis situation. So reviewing a pool of talent and the process for installing and training them is required, and especially where there are potentially sort of several candidates who might be at the same level, i.e. sort of several children or several cousins, etc. Ultimately, the board, as we know, is accountable and can be removed by the shareholders. So in drafting an emergency board plan, one needs to take into account the fact that there can be challenges from the shareholders, and therefore that's why I say sharing the board plan so that people understand and buy into the process avoids a night of the long knives when all of the current C-suite directors are removed because the shareholders feel that they want to take control. That's a disaster. And what sort of message does that send to suppliers and customers? It is much more logical to have an agreed protocol. And again, as I say, it's a difficult subject to approach because the board, particularly an operational board within a family business, are bound to choose day-to-day operation and profit over longer term planning. There's always a pressure on time. And so decisions around retaining succession advisors, considering internal and family candidates for board positions, determining what information is required to support an informed judgment on successors internally or externally tends to be put to the bottom of the pile. And it's particularly acute in a family business where I have seen operational boards feeling arguably sort of powerless and fearful, really a passive sort of nominal board in a way in discussing these issues because they feel that it's a sort of coup d'etat or some sort of power insurgence against the family shareholders. And that's very difficult for any non-family member or even a junior family member to approach with the older generation. So if it comes from the older generation and the emergency board plan is part of a blueprint for that succession process, then it's much easier to have that bought into by the remainder of the family. And there's sort of two elements here that we're navigating in tandem. One being helping the family to develop a succession and recruitment process. At the same time, we're starting on and touching on this overall governance framework for the business, which includes future roles for the family generally and how ownership itself will be dealt with, whether that's through trusts or lifetime transfers, and how the board is going to be selected and empowered. So this discussion is focused on emergency board plans, but I wanted to emphasize more generally the importance of the board, which is really a separate discussion, whether that's a formal board or a kitchen table board, and having an annual review process and policy in place around expected timelines for the key personnel, including key family shareholders and key family working in the business, and having a list of candidates identified, be that family or otherwise, that can be reviewed and monitored together with an appraisal of their relevant skill sets required for those particular roles is essential. PwC did a recent survey in suggesting that half of family business boards think about succession to themselves in a way, and engage with the shareholder group on that. I mean, that's a concern, and actually I'm not sure that was just family businesses. I think that's all businesses in a way. So from these last comments, we can see that one of the potential for benefit in the directors acting in the best interests of the company, nevertheless signing up to some sort of document where the directors acknowledge their role as within a family business, can be an important part as well. There is therefore potential for another policy here, which is not an emergency board plan, but some sort of board constitution, almost a board agreement, not a shareholders agreement. And this is sort of developing area in law in a way, because directors, as I say, have a direct responsibility to the company. So can directors agree within themselves and sign up to a sort of a protocol for how they will fulfill their duty if it is a legacy business? Because ultimately the board, in terms of dividend policy, in terms of whether to sell, in terms of sort of leveraging, in terms of CSR or philanthropy or otherwise, need to have some guidance and need to sign up to. And that's different to a shareholders agreement. It's a sort of directors agreement in a way. Anyway, we've talked about establishing a timeline, and one of the themes that runs through all of this is timing, because death, incapacity, current political or economic events are all entirely outside of control. And so if a business owner makes clear to the board his plans, it can make the board feel that they have more authority to discuss these otherwise taboo subjects openly. And that leads to consideration of what might happen if those plans were sort of suddenly implemented. So putting that sort of timeline together, I think it sits hand in hand. That's a bit of sort of the preamble in a way. Let's think about I guess a live situation, Paul, where you sort of where you might see this in practice. So it's not uncommon, for example, to have it's a slightly traditional example, I suppose, but maybe mum and dad family business. Dad perhaps sort of founded or is running the business essentially. Mum and dad are the directors. Why wouldn't they be? They probably own the shares 50-50, to be honest. So something happens to one of them, you've actually got a problem on decision making anyway in the background. But let's say mum and dad are the directors. So they are the board. Did mum and dad sit down at the kitchen table and discuss business? Yeah, I guess they do. Son and daughter, maybe they're now adults. They've been encouraged to go off and sort of do their own thing. But there's an expectation in their minds, at least, that they will have a role in the business. But it's sort of not really discussed, and dad still clearly enjoying the business and taking money out of it, and mum is sort of involved in the business. Maybe mum has an important role, but might defer traditional model in a way to dad on sort of key commercial decisions. That's sort of how things have been done, and it's a pretty happy situation, and responsibility is being dealt with in that way. In these sorts of situations, I'm afraid I do see these quite a lot. Dad has a number of key employees who are not on the board. As I say, it's mum and dad who are the board. They're the only directors. And those are maybe long-serving employees. They're trusted. They're sort of almost part of the family. You can imagine dad's in the office a huge amount. Mum comes in, everyone, it's a nice feeling, and everyone knows their place and knows their role. And in effect, those long-serving employees may be a effective CFO, or a financial director, an HR director, maybe a business development and communications director, and maybe a chief operating officer in a way, but not with actually those C-suite titles. They're not directors. That's sort of, well, there's no need to be, because it's much easier and swifter to make decisions if it's just mum and dad, or just dad in a way. So without consciously appreciating it, the family have sort of slightly encased themselves in cotton wool in a way, where they have some really good long-serving employees surrounding an individual or a pair of individuals, and everything works sort of in that, and because dad is able to say, yeah, this is what's happening. Now, say you're going through an important business deal, I mean, that could be anything, couldn't it? There is, so you're buying new premises, you're acquiring another smaller business, or you're taking some big bank borrowing or something like that. That's very easy for everyone to sort of do their job in a way, and then say to dad, so are we going to go ahead with this? And maybe dad says, yeah, we're going to go ahead. Let's say it's a purchase of a smaller business or something like that. Let's go ahead with this. If you don't have an emergency board plan, an EBP in place, just think about what will happen if dad suddenly dies. You can immediately play out in your mind what will happen. And And it can be an unfortunate sort of domino effect if there is no plan in place, because it's just too difficult to discuss. Dad is a single point of failure in the entire business. Maybe when mum raises the point to dad and says, well, what would happen if we were all reliant on you? What would happen if you weren't here? He's likely to say, oh, they know what to do. I've heard that several times. They know what to do. Business as usual. Is that really true? If there's a big thing going on, then how will decision making? Everyone is always coming into dad's room just to sort of get the answer and how to approach these things. So probably in the immediate days after death, while everyone's sort of in slight disarray, it probably is business as usual. They do know what to do. Everyone comes into the office, everyone comes to work. Maybe mum thinks, oh, I ought to sit down with the C-suite, or not C-suite, if there's no formal board, key employees, and talk to them about what's happening. So they have a meeting. Everyone sort of says how great dad was, etc., and sort of his passion and flair and all of this, and sort of like they're all very sorry, etc. And they can carry on sort of and sort of really supportive of mum and the family in this difficult time. The reality is that all of those people are going to be acutely concerned about their own future. They are going to be thinking, everyone knows that this is dad's business, he's not here. They will be looking at mum, and I will sort of leave out whether son or daughter come to this meeting. Let's assume they don't, and they just assume that everything's okay as well. They will be looking at mum for guidance and authority and clear leadership at a really difficult time, just when mum has lost her husband and is in grief, and perhaps has not really had that sort of clear understanding in a way of how business deals are approached. So that calms the nerves initially, but there's water cooler gossip already going on about sort of whether mum is going to make some changes to key staff. Maybe there's sort of some underlying issues there. One of the senior staff is sort of, I've seen this happen, sort of says, well, actually, I'm getting on myself a bit now. Maybe I should be thinking about sort of stepping down. That word sort of permeates around very quickly. So they ask mum at the meeting sort of what's going to happen with this acquisition we're in the middle of. And mum says, well, look, you know what to do. And that's reassuring in a way, and it goes down well. However, imagine how the seller of the target business is feeling at this point. There's sort of there's no that sort of voice and brand has disappeared. And if no one is phoning them immediately and reassuring them in a way, then they're going to be maybe saying, oh, well, I'm not sure I want to go ahead with this deal. Let's sort of talk about price and this sort of thing. Maybe you can imagine a situation, I will get back to the script in a second, but where son then sort of goes to mum and sort of says, well, look, I'm not sure about this deal that dad was doing. Maybe I should talk to the seller about this, because and mum says, yeah, fine. Yeah, you speak to the seller. Without any process in place, son phones up the seller says, well, I was just on the phone to your sort of head of operations, who I thought was discussing this. You can easily see how things suddenly fall apart. Mum loses authority or trust and confidence of the board. Son starts sort of coming in. Daughter is wondering how she fits into the picture, etc. And disorganization sort of prevails. And then possibly you would have senior staff saying, well, we don't feel that we have security, job security here. There's nothing in the will that we understand about. I mean, I've seen situations where mum sort of says at the meeting to the staff, oh, I'm looking for the will. I mean, it's quite scary. And I don't want to scaremonger too much on this session, but how little, by trying to bring it to life in a way, how little focus there tends to be on these sorts of situations. If the family had even a basic EBP, emergency board plan, signed by mum and dad as the effective board, even if they had that in draft with lots of square brackets, but a sort of an idea around, imagine how much better that situation would be. Mum could have said at that meeting that she's asking the sort of, I don't know, Terry, the CFO, the sort of financial director, he's going to chair this meeting, and he's aware of the key decisions from this document that need to be made in the first week. That's so reassuring, just having had that plan in place that could chair the meeting. The first thing they might say to do is, right, we are going to appoint these individuals to proper C-suite positions, so we have an effective board. There may be communication and knowledge about Dad's will, so that the board of directors know that the 50% of shares, so not a majority, but blocking anything, are immediately passed through to trustees of the will. Those trustees of the will might be at that meeting. If the protocol says so, they will have a voice and they will be able to be reassuring, particularly if the trustees are professionals or are people from business or otherwise who can be brought in. So the newly formed board could then meet with mum and the children, reassure them that there are clear guidelines and authority to proceed. They may say, we are going to employ, as was agreed, an external consultancy firm to help us over the next 12 months to advise on strategic aspects, particularly around this deal. The family are then reassured, the business has a governance and succession plan in place, people know their jobs are secure. The mum and children can then have and not feel that they're inadvertently sort of explaining to everyone in the business that there's no plan, which is the risk. They sort of slightly throw their hands up. Mum and the children can have pre-agreed immediate private discussions with their succession planning lawyers, people like myself, and about the transition of ownership, so that the shares and the way that they are governed, the tax position, business property relief, otherwise, the way that shares might transfer into trust, how those are governed, how the shareholdings and decision making will be made at the shareholder level, looking at those reserve matters that may be part of that board plan, etc., or associated shareholders agreement. I mean, in this situation, you're unlikely to have a shareholders agreement between mum and dad, so there won't be reserved matters in that way. There won't be that sort of protocol in place that you would find in a more established board. So an emergency board plan can cover all of that. So yeah, go ahead.
Just jumping in, because I need just to draw you to the point there. So yeah, it's quite a bleak pitch. If you haven't got an emergency board plan, just in terms of, I don't know, maybe check signatories, passwords for systems, all that type of stuff, and then the practical stuff about if a deal's going on, who's doing what, the role of the board, the people that are on the board, or the management team. So I guess the two questions I want to ask is, how many family businesses really have an emergency board plan? And I'm reading between the lines and assuming it's not as many as there should be. And so secondly, why is it, when it's such a serious question and there are such serious things, maybe a multi-generational family business that's got 250, 300 staff, that's been around for generations, core in the community, has lots of responsibilities, not just to the family, but to those families that work there. Why isn't it on the, why are there so few, and why aren't they being created, and why is it not on the agenda?
I mean, they're exactly the right questions, Paul. And I mean, I guess that's sort of hopefully the benefit of having a session like today, because I think it's taboo. I think that the existing board, if there is an independent board, think and naturally assume that because it's a family business, the family will have thought about this. They will say, oh, well, it's family, therefore it's going to go down a certain line, and therefore there will be a new head. And actually, that means that we don't have to think about a successor to the board or otherwise. So it sort of assumes that it's fine because it's a family business. And I mean, the practical reality is, I mean, we do a lot of this sort of approach to governance work, but it is a sad fact that I really don't, well, no business that I have been speaking to about this has said, here's my emergency board plan or crisis management plan. Some will have a list of sort of risk review areas and key elements, but there is generally no protocol for emergency decisions within the first hour, within the first week, within the first month, etc. I mean, the sort of getting to sort of come at some of the key sort of summary points, Paul. I think the things you need to think about here are: will an independent director need to take the lead in convening a special executive session to discuss succession issues? And will they be able to call on other independent directors to act quickly in a crisis? That independent decision making, and whether that is family or independent, key part of this. Provided there is a plan in place, then, and it is a non-family CEO, then that CEO can help the shareholders make an objective assessment of the merits of the spouse, the children, etc., in terms of the leadership position. Now that's difficult, as I've said, but you can have some machinery around that. the same can be said of a non-executive chairman role, and there might be some changing of existing roles within the EBP where the non-exec chairman, who might be a family member, and the CEO sort of swap in a way or otherwise. Because a non-exec family chairman with an external CEO is a very attractive structure on paper, but can often end up being entirely phatic and without any teeth at all, because the CEO is essentially a COO without real function. Another part of the emergency board plan: what advice would be given to the outside world, and when? Who is going to advise on public relations and investor relations? Who's going to speak to the bank? How are those phone calls going to be dealt with quickly to reassure people and suppliers that there's not going to be any disruption? Are you going to employ a search firm immediately for certain roles, a firm that knows the company and can work on an expedited basis? Are you going to instruct a crisis management firm, one that can provide interim leadership? Not for this session, but how are you going to ensure that there is a check and balance on the CEO? You don't want to have someone who steps in and then is making a horlicks of it, and then there's no process around review and discussion on that. Dividend policy. I mean, I've seen situations where the family immediately say, oh, well, we need to get some money out. We need some sort of working capital because dad's accounts are frozen in probate. What's the dividend policy in these sorts of situations? A lot of family business owners say it pays dividends not to pay dividends. There's sort of good matrimonial protection. There's good reasons why you would reinvest into the business. But next generation will have a very different view about that. And the board need to be absolutely clear around dividend policy. That leads into other discussions around wills and succession generally that we haven't really got time for. Incapacity, powers of attorney. You can create a business power of attorney rather than an ordinary power of attorney, specifically in relation to business assets. So this is not talking about death, but this is talking about emergency crisis where a founder of a business is in a coma. I mean, it's almost a worse situation for you can imagine in the sort of example I gave, when everyone gathers round, etc., they're thinking, oh, well, I assume he'll get better. Sort of, how do we make you? And actually his shares then can't be voted, not that there would necessarily be a vote, because he's incapacitated. So having a business power of attorney, appointing the right people who can make business decisions on the shares, really important. Let's just run through those key tenets of an emergency board plan. Have a table of decision-making authority. Specific situations can recover reserved matters, but be careful with reserved matters. Successor chair, whether that's executive or non-executive. Interim COO, who will meet with the customers, deal with operations. An interim CFO, if you don't already have one. Role of external advisory, plan around taking in external advisory help and consultancy. Trusted friends. Are there friends who could be a chairman, discuss with other families of similar businesses, other top managers? You can have a kind of, like we have at Boodle Hatfield, a kind of disaster recovery plan within the business. And we will work with another law firm so that people have somewhere to go if there's that sort of emergency problem, and we can call on their management team to assist us. So having a trusted, which Family Business United, and I mean, that's a great melting pot of being able to sort of buddy up with other family businesses to deal with crisis situations. Legal, think about a general counsel being employed to cover the huge legal issues that may arise, or appointing specific strategic advisors. Budget, do you have a budget for an emergency situation? It's tempting to say, no, we've got to cut costs. This is going to be a difficult transition. We don't want to be taking advice and getting consultancy firms in. That's planning to fail. Have a clear and understood budget as part of the emergency plan. Communication plan, reassure owners, reassure customers, reassure employees and lenders. Identify action priorities for the first quarter, the first year, etc. Make notes of capabilities about the effective board. This can all go into the plan. Move slowly from this passive board to a strategic fiduciary board, as I've discussed, and engage with all other stakeholders. Potentially have an executive search firm specializing in recruiting an interim CEO, and others that would have a sort of a limited contract to aid that transition period. So ensure that the emotional anxiety essentially that can come with these immediate sort of crisis positions are converted into a we're all in this together mentality within the business. And clarity in roles and communication is hugely important on this. So if I was going to summarize, Paul, what the key tenets of the emergency board plan are, I would say communications, operations, risk and advisory, shareholder representation, and board decision-making protocol with reserved matters. So those 5 things, I would say, and I've gone into some detail, and if we've got time, can go into a bit more detail of any more of those, but those are the key things I would say need to be in this. And I mean, if it's helpful, Paul, we've seen this before, and so we draft, and to an extent we have precedents of emergency board plans where to an extent the family business can fill in the gaps, but it triggers a lot of thinking around these sorts of communications, operations, risk, share representation, and decision-making protocols.
And I think what you've just said there, for me, it's a lot of it comes around good governance, good management, and just general day-to-day good communication of the key things within any business. That's as you say, there's roles, responsibilities, and authority on a day-to-day basis. And actually take away that figurehead or the leader, that people are empowered to continue to do what they do on a daily basis for the best interest of the business. And it is how that's documented and communicated. A quick question in terms of, do you think it's more of an issue for a first generation business, or is it no different when you become 5th, 6th, 7th generation, where you've got more staff and more and maybe a bigger business too? Is it? I just wonder if it's a bigger first generation issue.
It is. You're absolutely right. It's a good question. Entrepreneurial first generation businesses are very focused on the business and the day to day, and in a sense, they have not lived through themselves the challenges of a succession and quite what that means. However, amazingly, 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation businesses, because there are more people involved and more views to take in account of, still find it, even if you have a sort of a family office within your business, still find it really difficult to actually put pen to paper on an emergency plan. I mean, because at the end of the day, I mean, even if you've got sort of, I don't know, sort of 4 cousins or something, if you can at least identify who will be the interim chair, then everyone can plan around that. But that is actually a very difficult decision unless you already have some machinery and process in place in terms of, that's why I talked quite a lot about that sort of overall monitoring in a way and looking for the skill sets to come in. Otherwise, even as something as simple as that, which is going to be, I used mum in the example because I think that is often sort of ignored, I mean, without being sort of sexist about it in a way, that people assume, or the children often assume, that they will step into a position of authority, whereas it's quite often that mum or dad, whichever way around it is, has been hugely involved in the business and would actually see themselves as the network's representative chair. That is absolutely, in a first generation business, a discussion that is actually really difficult to have.
And down the line, I guess, a multi-generational business, and you've got more than 2 of the next generation, then you're looking at mum or dad who are going through a very emotional time, having just lost their partner, and the kids are going to look to them to make the decisions at a time when emotionally they're not going to necessarily have the emotional capacity to make those decisions in the best interests of either the family, the individuals, or the business either. So it's the decisions that are being made are really complex and emotive time for everyone involved, aren't they? That's when the plan and documenting it and communication will help take away at least a layer of the pain you're going through, and at least give you a framework to work towards.
That's absolutely right. And that is where using external advisory and consultants can have a real benefit in those times, because in a way, it's not going to, whatever decisions are made in that first year, you've got big shoes to fill. It's going to be really difficult. And actually, while everyone is adjusting and grieving, as you say, and dealing with what this transition really means and looks like, being the one in the chair and having to tell everyone else and sort of maintain that element of security and reassurance is really difficult. And actually, if you can outsource that to give you a bit of time to think and actually as a family discuss privately, that can be, but you're only going to be able to do that and react to that if you've got an emergency board plan. Otherwise, events go so fast that you suddenly find, we've already made decisions here. It's too late.
Yeah, and I think now probably more than ever for the current generation of business owners that are looking at their age and their mortality, I think having just been through a pandemic, whilst nobody died, everybody was temporarily incapacitated because they didn't know quite what they did when they closed the doors for the last time when the first lockdown happened. They've kind of almost been through that, the shit's hit the fan conversation. Where do we go tomorrow? Where are we going to? Then how we communicate with our staff, which is a big issue for a lot of CEOs with staff at home all over the country. They've almost probably had the initial emergency board planning from a business perspective discussions. It's now formalizing those into a document that could be added to from the family side and turned into a document that becomes living and breathing and evolves over time going forward. So I think they've probably had some of these conversations, but not really realized that they've had them already.
I mean, that's absolutely right. And actually these discussions, and it's sort of probably why we've got this session on the agenda in a way, because actually for the first time, people have seen a situation where they're like, well, that is an emergency, that is a crisis. And well, I mean, look at the government, and no one really had a plan around how to deal with this. I mean, and so with businesses did adapt, and they will be able to learn from the way they approach that. Capturing that now is absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. It's absolutely the right time to do it because it's very real. That's why at the beginning I was saying succession planning can be so difficult to approach with family businesses because it is really, particularly first generation, it is a really arbitrary concept. It's sort of the governance isn't there. Where do you start? This is a really good place to start, and business owners will be engaged and say, yeah, I've got answers to that because this is what happened during COVID. You're absolutely right.
There's just bits of that emergency board plan based on the tenets you talked about that they can almost drop in their response to those 2 or 3 bits already. So it's starting to form that plan.
It is, and that's sort of our precedence when we do it's almost a series of questions of those key tenets that you then play through, and it's surprising how that discussion really triggers sort of some open discussion generally, and that concern around the staff that you mentioned, and sort of how it's communicated to the staff and how the staff are feeling and their reassurance. You can't overemphasize that because the family tend to feel that they're the ones grieving, and that they're the ones who need the support. And it's really easy to slightly neglect the staff who are probably actually feeling more vulnerable than anyone else.
Yeah, many of them have been multi-generational families working in family businesses as well. So they're told all the time that they're part of the family. That's the worst time to cut them out.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, and it's just natural, isn't it, that people will have sort of really close relationships with particular individuals, and if there's disruption to that, then sort of, I mean, have you done your own sort of succession planning as a staff member in a way to make sure that you do understand what that is? It's a fascinating area, and I mean, obviously, I'm afraid, Paul, there isn't a right answer to it, but getting that conversation started and putting those tenets down and how you would deal with them practically, I think that's sort of what decisions for the first week, what decisions for the first month, for the first year, that to me really resonates because they are increasingly difficult decisions, and it can be business as usual, and people do know what to do for the first week, probably for the first month, first quarter.
Yeah, really good advice, Hayden. Look, I can see it's your passion. It comes through clearly in terms of what you do on a day-to-day. You've given some really good food for thought there in terms of the conversation and things to take away. So I'm going to leave it there. We will share the article that you've written for us with the audience and make it more publicly available to try and help those conversations, obviously share contact details and everything else. But no, your stories, your authenticity in terms of the conversation, hopefully it's meant a lot. I've taken a lot away, and I'm not running a large business with family members and everything else. But actually, I think those that have done, it will give them plenty of food for thought. So thank you very much for your thoughts today, and look forward to continue the conversation with you later.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, Paul. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Hayden.
Okay, bye.